There is a batting order in front of you. And as needs must, batting orders sometimes change. And this is going to change today, because the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Brown, has got some news for us in connection with Ronnie. So he is in fact going to open that. Vice-Chancellor.
I arrived at the University of Liverpool, I'm afraid, a little too late to actually get to know Professor Ronnie Finn. But everyone has told me what a highly respected professor he was, but not only that, and much more than that, what a highly likeable man he was. And I think that's underlined by the really amazing turnout we have here this evening. Unfortunately, as Mrs. Finn knows, I have to go on elsewhere, as Vice-Chancellors tend to have to do, but I didn't want to be here this evening, and it gives me great pleasure to be able to announce that the University has decided to name a chair. Who fills it in due course. Meantime, I know you're going to have a wonderful evening celebrating a wonderful man's life. Thank you.
And say that my first meeting with Ronnie was as a final year medical student, when he acted as our medical tutor at Sept General Hospital in 1964. He was an outstanding teacher, bringing great clarity to clinical practice, history taking and then examination. At the time, he was the medical registrar and was working for Dr. Heinz Fuld. At the time, not, but now, my father-in-law. Heinz said that after an evening ward round at 6:30 p.m, Ronnie would thank him for the round, discuss matters of the day, and inform him that he was rushing off to do some real work. In the event, this was the research work being performed in the Department of Medicine with Sir Cyril Clarke, and about which we'll hear more from John Corn. Ronnie himself had qualified 10 years earlier in Liverpool, in 1954, with a distinction in public health and the prize in forensic medicine. Each of these achievements were to prescience his career. He trained as an SHO and registrar in Liverpool, coming into contact at the Liverpool Royal Infirmary with his close relative, Lord Cohen of Birkenhead, with whom he shared many genes, who was then the Professor of Medicine. However, it was Sir Cyril Clarke who was to inspire Ronnie's interest in genetics. In a vintage year for Ronnie, but not for Claret, 1958, he obtained his membership and MD. Ronnie was then a Fulbright Scholar of the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in Baltimore, where he came under the influence of the great Victor McCusick. On his return, he was soon appointed consultant physician to Sept General Hospital and the Royal Southern Hospital. Here he made lifelong friendships with a physician and the Home Office pathologist, Dr. Charleston Hill, who died only recently and whose daughter we welcome here this evening. Ronnie generated scientific inquiry into all he touched, and he developed with Dr. Dinge Riding at the Southern Hospital only the second intensive therapy unit on Merseyside. Ronnie was a great believer in cooperation, and he and Peter Drury, an anaesthetist, not only developed protocols for the care of patients with hematemesis, which was an innovation in those days, and for which the Royal Southern Hospital had more than its fair share, being alongside the docs with the alcoholic doctors, but also joint authorship of their book, A Guide to the Intensive Care Unit. At Sept General Hospital with John Goldsmith, who is unable to be with us this evening, and then at the Royal Liverpool Hospital with Michael Bone, he developed renal services on Merseyside and beyond, and Mike Bone will speak about this aspect of his work. At the Royal, while practicing clinical medicine on the wards and in the outpatients, Ronnie observed the common illnesses amongst his patients. He He stimulated many junior staff and colleagues, including myself, and he was enthusiastic researching the unorthodox as well as the conventional. Thus he became a founder member and subsequently president of the British Society for Allergy and Environmental Medicine. And I'm delighted that Dr. Jean Munro will tell us about this aspect of Ronnie's work in the UK later. His links with the sister organisation in the USA were very strong, and its president, who can't be with us this evening, wrote that Ronnie was, I've just taken 2 words from his letter, an ace ecologist. About this time, in the decade of the 80s, he consolidated his interest in the interaction between man's environment and his genetic makeup, which led to a long series of original research papers on, for example, salt and hypertension, hydrocarbons and kidney disease, diet and food intolerance, and the etiology of Alzheimer's disease and later chronic fatigue syndrome. Dr. Peter Coyle will inform us about this. On an entirely different front, Ronnie treated Mrs. Gerard Sanderson for ophthalmic shingles with the drug acyclovir, only licensed at the time for systemic viral infections in transplant patients. So good was her recovery without eye damage or neuralgia that single-handedly he forced Burroughs Wellcome to market the drug for shingles, and this is now standard practice, and so Virex can be bought over the counter. A classic example of simple clinical observation leading to the improved quality of the public's health. Like Lord Cohen, Ronnie was involved in much administration, but of a very different sort. Not the GMC, not the Department of Health, but as a regional advisor and specialist medical advisor for the Royal College of Physicians. He was meetings secretary and a council member, as well as being on the inaugural postgraduate committee of the Liverpool Medical Institution, and postgraduate clinical tutor for over a decade at the Royal Liverpool Hospital. He and I shared a secretary, James Stevenson, and a room at that time. He pulled his full weight in clinical medicine, both at the Southern and at the Royal, and in undergraduate and postgraduate teaching. And Michael Orr will touch on this aspect of his life. Ronnie also sat as a member of the Medical Appeal Tribunal and on the Liverpool and Regional Health Authority boards. For several years latterly, he was chairman of the University Medical Archives Committee, and it's a pleasure to welcome Adrian Allen here this evening. Soon after retirement, Ronnie was awarded a personal chair, a recognition by the university of his great talent, but its delay, indeed it was belated, is not surprising in a man who did not seek publicity despite his tremendous personal contribution to medicine, in this city, this university, nationally and internationally. Professor Philip Ludd will speak about the man in this connection. Whilst Joan and Jonathan Finn will tell us of Ronnie's life at home, if not actually outside medicine, he will be remembered by Susan and I as a wonderful tutor, a friend who will always have time to listen and consider. He was very well organised, unhurried and unflappable. He was a doctor with a great fund of stories, both orthodox and unorthodox. Thank you. I now have pleasure in inviting Jonathan to tell us the real story of his dad.
Thank you, Chris. But Vice-Chancellor, ladies and gentlemen, it's with a heavy heart but great pride that I'm standing here today addressing such a large and distinguished gathering in honour of my late father. It is hard to believe that just a year ago, my father was in perfect health, and we gathered to celebrate his life. celebrate it, we must. To many of you, my father was one of the leading figures in medicine, not only in Liverpool, but nationally and internationally. His contributions across so many areas were very special indeed. In particular, his work towards the discovery of a cure for rhesus disease in newborn babies, which has resulted in the saving of countless lives. But to my sister Sharon and myself, he was just dear old Dad, and also a loving grandfather to Emma and Ben. Like countless other families in the 70s, growing up in the Finn family was a very normal place to be, consisting of 2 parents, 2 children, and a dog. My sister and I had a solid upbringing, which was loving, stable, stimulating, and very real. My father, as a great family man, was always at the heart of it all, with gentle words of encouragement and advice for all of us. And in particular, he was a devoted husband to my mother throughout their marriage. Aside from being a caring physician, my father was a very down-to-earth man with a love of nature. One of his great joys in life was going for a long walk in the open air. In particular, he spent many hours walking along the beautiful sand dunes of Crosby Beach. He would drive down to the beach and then walk, and walk, and walk. And more importantly, think and think and think. He used to call these walks his thinking walks. I had the pleasure of joining him on many of them, and it was there that I felt closest to him. We would chat about so many things, my interests, his interests, life, the universe, work and sport. Above all, my father used to lecture me on how to better myself. The key themes were always the same. Number 1, lots of hard work. Number 2, lots of exercise. And number 3, not too much social at the expense of work. These themes became a little boring to me, as they were repeated on a regular basis from my teenage years right into my university days at the London School of Economics. So I decided to simplify the process. Whenever my father raised any of these points, I would say, Dad, that's number 1. Dad, that's number 3. He used to smile at me, and then we'd move on to far more serious business, usually concerning Liverpool Football Club. My father was blessed with so many qualities, which all who knew him came to recognise and appreciate. One of those qualities was his tremendous loyalty. This stretched into so many areas, including to his family, to his hometown of Liverpool, and to his country. With respect to Liverpool, my father loved this city and used to take enormous pride in telling people where he was from. Very often the feedback he got was Liverpool, the hometown of the Beatles, to which my father would beam. Little did they realise that he was not the slightest bit interested in the Beatles and was unlikely even to recognise one of the Fab Four. My father, the sportsman, is little known. However, he was a rugby man and a great and loyal supporter of Liverpool Rugby Club, the oldest rugby union club in the country. He supported them from a young age and stuck by them through good times and bad for over 50 years. Unfortunately, the bad times were rather more frequent than the good times. I remember standing by my father's side on many Saturday afternoons in my early years, watching his team play very average rugby, whilst I was itching to get to Anfield to watch world-beating football. Another key area of loyalty for my father was his tremendous patriotism for the country. He proudly did his national service in the British Army for 1 year when he was 18. He had a great year and particularly delighted in telling my sister and I that he won the title of Best Pistol Shooter in his regiment. Christmas Day was another fine example of my father's patriotism. The Finn family would troop to my father's ward at the Royal Liverpool Hospital every Christmas morning to wish the patients and the staff a happy Christmas. And then we'd rush back for the Christmas lunch and the James Bond film. But the key event for my father on that day was always 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the Queen's speech. Amid the fine food and chit-chat, my father would quieten the family down for the Queen's address to the nation. And we would all be forced, against our will, to rise in unison to the national anthem. Fine tradition. My father will be remembered by many for his intelligence, his humility, and his warmth. He also possessed a fine sense of humour, and delighted in telling so many amusing stories and witty anecdotes to family, friends, and colleagues. He enjoyed watching comedy on TV, and one of his favourite programmes was The Two Ronnies. With my father on the settee next to me, watching that programme, I often felt the 3 Ronnies. The numbers who've come today, and the numbers who have agreed to speak about my late father, is a true testament to how much he was loved. It really means a lot to my mother, my sister Sharon, and myself to see you all here today. My father would be very touched to know that this is happening in his honour. Thank you very much.
Sunday in the Observer, Richard Ingham's, in his pithy column on the back page, said that the most dreaded sentence in the English language was, "The doctor's ready to see you now." But in fact he wanted to modify that, because he'd been to a function the day before and had gone through the door about to sit down for a meal when someone said to him, "Richard, would you mind saying a few words?" It is a testimony to Ronnie that so many people have agreed to say a few words, but they did get more advanced warning than that. And I'm delighted that Professor John Corley, who's our next contributor, is going to tell us about Ronnie, Rhesus and the Lasker Prize. John.
Thank you, Chris. You're relieved to hear I'm the only person with any overhead slides. I hope. Turn the lights on, will it? It'll brighten up in a minute. Well, the aim of my brief talk is to tell you about Ronnie's contribution to the problem of rhesus hemolytic disease and how this led up to the award in 1980 of his Lasker Prize. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about the Lasker. I'm then going to give you a little overview of rhesus hemolytic disease. Then I'll try to give you some insight into Ronnie's specific contributions. And then I'll end up again with the Lasker. So the next slide, please, Bob, tells you about the Lasker. It was founded, the foundation was established in 1942 as far as I can tell, and the first award was in 1944. And as Ronnie told me, they were announced each year in September, and the actual award took place in November at a hotel which I subsequently visited, called the St. Regis in New York, in November each year. And its purpose, as stated on the website, I'll read you if I may. It's to recognise and honour individuals who have made significant contributions in basic and clinical research in the diseases which are the main causes of disability and death. In the United States, these are cardiovascular diseases, cancer, mental illnesses, respiratory diseases, arthritis, and neurological diseases. The underlinings are mine because these, I think, give you an idea of the areas to which Ronnie's work applies. To give you some importance of the Lasker Prize, I'll tell you list some of the luminaries that have been awarded. But I should start for the non-medical members of the audience by saying that it's now thought of as the American Nobel in Biomedical Sciences. Now the next slide shows you some of the names of people who've got the prize. I can draw your attention to McFarlane Burnett in 1952, in fact for his work on influenza virus rather than on the clonal selection theory, which he later got the Nobel for. You see the famous Watson and Crick in 1960 for the structure of DNA, the famous Fred Sanger, along with perhaps less well-known Gilbert, DNA sequencing, and then no less a figure than Milstein for hybridomas and monoclonal antibodies. Also draw your attention to the fact, because we'll come back to this later, that Landsteiner, Weiner and Levine in 1946 had already been awarded the Lasker for defining the basic pathology of rhesus hemolytic disease. So the next slide is the basic pathology as identified by those people. Now the idea here is that normally when the body tissues are exposed to a non-self antigen, the immune system then produces specific antibodies that then neutralize the antigen, the protein, and cause its elimination. Now, 15% of women in this country lack a protein on the surface of their red cells called the rhesus antigen. And this means that if the maternal red cells cross the placenta into the fetus, and they I've got it the wrong way around in my nerves, I'm sorry. If the red cells of the baby cross the placenta into the mother, they can potentially immunize the mother. She makes anti-rhesus antibodies, and those anti-rhesus antibodies then can potentially pass back across the placenta into the fetus, where they can lead to fatal anemia, hydrops fetalis, or in the neonatal period, terrible jaundice that can damage the nervous system, cause this thing called connectors. Now, the next slide shows an example of hydrops. From this riveting book, by the way, which Ronnie gave me and I've now passed on to the library. It's riveting read, I can tell you. And very, very complimentary to Ronnie. So here's a hydropic fetus, newborn, that die in the first few hours of life. Next slide, please. Now, what about Ronnie's contribution? Now, what I'm going to do here is on this first slide outline what I believe were Ronnie's contributions, and then in the next two slides give you more circumstantial details, if you like, of these contributions. Now, as I understand it, Ronnie was the first to show, and I'll come to more detail in a moment, that immunization of the mother occurs mainly at delivery, when, in the trauma of the delivery, fetal red cells pass into the maternal circulation. He was the first to show, in a prospective study, that ABO incompatibility protects, ABO incompatibility between the fetus and the mother protects the mother from immunization. He was the first to show that feto-maternal bleed, as well as ABO incompatibility, determine whether or not the mother is immunized. And he realized, and this is on record, in 1960, that there was the potential that giving the mother anti-rhesus antibody immediately after delivery would destroy the fetal cells and thereby prevent immunization. And he went on to prove this, first of all in male, rhesus-negative male volunteers, and then subsequently in the real thing, pregnant ladies. Now some circumstantial details. Ronnie came to this story, as I understand it from this book, in 1958, when he was assigned by Cyril Clarke the MD topic, the relationship of ABO and rhesus. The work, as I understand it, Joan, was performed in the Ashton Street building, and it started with the first prospective study concerning this idea of ABO incompatibility protecting the mother from immunization. And the work extended, it isn't right, Chris, it wasn't 58, he got the MD in 61, according to this book, that's right, isn't it, Joan? In 61, 3 years' work, where, as Chris has already alluded to, he was part-time, but he very much worked the night shift in the evenings and the weekends. Amazing that I don't think that would be possible now. And quite early on in these studies, as early as later in that year, he made this statement. All the data, this was his prospective study, all the data are therefore consistent with an ABO-incompatible fetus giving complete protection against rhesus sensitization. Now, very importantly, but why are so many AVO-compatible pregnancies protected? And this, I think, was truly the insight that enabled Ronnie to go into, to make the great contribution he did. Indeed, it so intrigued him that Zimmerman points out in this book that right at the start of his MD thesis, on the very first page, he makes this statement. One of the most puzzling features of erythroblastosis, that's hemolytic disease of the newborn, is that it occurs in only 5% of rhesus women, negative women at risk. And that was the overwhelming thought, I think, in all this work, as you'll see in the next slides. Now, he was enabled in this work, as often happens in great discoveries in medicine, a technique becomes available that enables the work to be done. And this was so in Ronnie's case. And the technique was the Kleihauer technique, which was first described in 1957, apparently. I didn't know this until I read the book. And it was first shown by Ziberski in 1959, about a year after he started the MD, that this technique, the Kleihauer technique, could be used to quantitate the extent of the feto-maternal bleed. And I'll illustrate that in a moment. And using this Kleihauer technique, apparently they used it almost immediately after Ziberski's publication. He was able to show that large, substantial feto-maternal bleeds are uncommon, occurring perhaps only 10% of pregnancies, and that this not occurring, if you like, is the dominant protective mechanism preventing ladies not becoming immunised. He also showed, and this was the mechanism, if you like, of the protection by AVO incompatibility, that these maternal bleeds are only detectable when the mother and fetus are AVO compatible. And of course it was that realisation that led to the idea that an antibody, in this case anti-rhesus antibody, could protect the mother. And this idea was first stated apparently at the Liverpool Medical Institution just down the road on February 18th in 1960. So I don't know what other great discoveries have been announced there, but this is certainly one in 1960. Next one, please, Ron. And here's a nice illustration, I hope Joan approves of it, from this book, which shows Ronnie here doing a Kleihauer with a microscope, and this shows what he was seeing. Here, the dark cells are the fetal cells, so these fetal cells have refluxed into the maternal circulation, and when the fetus and mother are AVO incompatibility, you don't see these fetal cells. Next one, please. So now what about anti-rhesus therapy? Well, I've already alluded to this idea that it's a big bleed, but I perhaps haven't emphasised that the timing of the bleed is important, otherwise you couldn't so easily prevent it. And the timing of the bleed is mainly at the time of delivery, when there's all this trauma going on at the utero-placental junction. So it was the timing and the fact that it was the mechanism, if you like, of immunisation, led on to the idea of using antibody. And he at first apparently used the technique in rhesus-negative policemen. Apparently he couldn't do it on convicts in this country, it's against the law. And in America, so I can't. Anyway, 6 rhesus-negative policemen were immunised, and he showed that crude serum could reduce the number of rhesus-positive cells injected into the volunteers, but they were still sensitized. So there was initial disappointment, if you like, and as often in great discoveries, you have to persist. And in fact, he went in that same year, 1981, I think it is Joan, isn't it, to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. This apparently was a long-standing arrangement in the Department of Medicine. And fortunately, he was able to continue the rhesus work there and have access to more purified antibodies, and as I understand it, volunteer prisoners. So the work was moved forward in his time in Baltimore. Then when he came back to Liverpool, he was a major player in establishing the trial in pregnant women, and the fantastic success of the technique first published in the BMJ in January 1965. I think the BMJs, I don't think the BMJ gets quite so many overwhelmingly important papers nowadays. They must be very pleased that they published this paper in 65. So I think that gives you some idea of the overwhelming importance of all this and why it led to the Alaska. And the next one, there's the rather poor copy, I'm afraid to say, of Ronnie Ronnie's Lasker citation, which he gave to the Department of Medicine, I think in 2001. I'm not absolutely sure of the year. And this is a copy. And obviously you can't read all this, but if I can just read out the summary of it on the website, of the Lasker website. And there it is, a direct quote. For brilliantly elucidating the immunological protective mechanisms in pregnancy and for showing how an Rh antibody can defend the unborn child. So I have just one more slide. I hope, therefore, I've convinced you that this was truly one of the most important clinical discoveries since the war. As Jonathan has alluded to, it saved countless babies' lives. In the Zimmerman book, it's estimated that it saves about 5,000 infant deaths a year in the US alone. So if you multiply that up over the years and over the countries, you can see what an enormous number of children's lives it saved. In the Liverpool context, I think it's completely uncontroversial that it's the most important discovery from the Liverpool Medical School since the war. And I think it's also uncontroversial, having read this, now there has been controversy, but no doubt in my mind, that although this was a team effort, Ronnie was the major player. Thank you.
I'm going to concentrate particularly on his time at the Royal Southern. I think others will be talking about the Royal and the Real Work, etc. When I arrived in Liverpool at the Royal Southern, totally new to Liverpool in 1975, it was Ronnie who particularly was welcomed. Working as I did with Alistair Breckenridge and also with Gerald Sanderson, who has been mentioned, but it was Ronnie who particularly stood out and helped me through the various processes when you come to a strange hospital for the first time. To me, the Royal Southern was a very friendly hospital, and it was very easy to make links with surgeons, orthopedic surgeons, radiologists, pathologists, etc., which is so much more difficult in the sort of big hospital we have now at Royal Liverpool. And that was made much easier for me with Ronnie's support. The physical plant of the Royal Southern led something to be desired, perhaps, but certainly spiritually it was a lovely place to be. In the early days, I was sometimes criticised for the syndrome of over-investigation, and it was here again that Ronnie was particularly supportive. I recall a particular case after I'd been in Liverpool, I guess about 6 months, when we admitted a 70-year-old, I won't call them elderly in this circulation, they were in their 70s, and they were admitted for falling over. Thought to be senile, but actually inquiry revealed a history of falling over and hitting his head about 4 weeks before. Knew from the Hammersmith and keen to investigate, I was keen that a brain scan should be done, but there was great scepticism elsewhere that this was a pointless exercise. For once, things worked out. And it was with Ronnie's support that this was very much done. In due course, brain scan was done, subdural hemorrhage was identified, evacuated by the neurosurgeons, and the patient walked out of the hospital reasonably fit and well. And certainly, it helped me very much in the future when I felt investigations should be done. And I have Ronnie to thank very much for that. As you've heard already, Ronnie ran the intensive care unit with Dean Riding, but this was an unusual arrangement because usually in this situation anaesthetists did and have done since made a takeover of it, and perhaps quite rightly, to running IT units. But the unit that Ronnie ran was very friendly, but very efficient too, and a wonderful resource for teaching. We used to take medical students on the ward, and Ronnie, throughout his time there and later, was very supportive of educational efforts.
Thank you, Christopher. Ronnie was one of the giants in academic medicine in the University of Liverpool, the medical school at the Royal Liverpool University Hospital. And as John Corley described, his contribution to medical science began very early in his career, the work on rhesus disease. Recognition took the usual 20-odd years before he and Cyril Clarke were awarded the Lasker Prize. But in the meantime, he had followed his intellectual curiosity along several related pathways, establishing on the way, and I hope I've got this right, because I took it from one of the obituaries, the British Society for Allergy, Environmental and Nutritional Medicine, which embraced these varied interests. He was attracted to renal medicine and transplantation as a newly appointed consultant by the immunological challenge. Now, at that time, therapy in transplantation was more akin to the use of weapons of mass destruction than to peaceful negotiation. And I think it still is. As far as the kidney is concerned, the only disease that responds convincingly to the use of steroids, which is a condition called minimal change glomerulonephritis, is still the only disease with no evidence for immunological involvement. And so Ronnie returned to the environment for clues. Now, hydrocarbon exposure was not an obvious choice, but the slow search succeeded, especially after Dr. Gordon Bell brought from Edinburgh an effective methodology that was also cheap. This was because it relied not on a laboratory or technicians, etc., but on a questionnaire administered over the hospital telephone by unpaid volunteers. Now, his economies with words are shown by his successful intervention at the beginning of the expansion of dialysis on Merseyside. In the late 1970s, money was available from Chancellor Jim Callaghan. We'd only just got the first self-dialysis unit off the ground at Mossley Hill, with the help of Joan West and others. But it seemed to be working, and while it takes usually 6 to 10 pages of close argument on paper to establish a case of need, Ronnie simply wrote a single sentence on one side of A5 paper to Dr. John Goldsmith, senior nephrologist, advising that we develop 2 further units, one in North Liverpool under Rashid Ahmed, who's also here today, and the other on Wirral under my own supervision. Thus began the satellite dialysis expansion on Merseyside that is unique in the United Kingdom. Indeed, we are still 10 to 15 years ahead of most other centres, and I think Ronnie would enjoy the thought of this, a good 25 years ahead of Manchester. As dear John let us go, it was a small miracle. On the clinical and personal front, he was a warm and supportive colleague, an excellent raconteur, and with a slow, deliberate, but perfectly timed delivery, he regaled generations of medical students with tales of Dr. Baker Bates, the local medical legend who bridged the gap between Lord Cohen of Birkenhead and Cyril Clarke. One of these stories featured the next speaker, or who was going to be the next speaker, Professor Sir David Weatherall, when he was a house officer in the old Liverpool Royal Infirmary. It also featured the matron, a mirror of undetermined length, a set of open trouser buttons at the front, and a resignation which was then withdrawn, all within 24 hours. His patience and slowness to anger made him a perfect colleague in the kidney unit, but these qualities are not always prominent. And also in transplantation, where they're even more seldom seen. He had spent a year in transplantation at an early stage as a consultant, so he knew what it was all about. His capacity for helping to resolve conflicts between personalities can be illustrated by the following words of encouragement that he gave to me on one of these occasions. "Well, Mike," he said, and there was a pause, "all you have to do," and there was another pause, "is to wait." Pause. 3 or 4, and there was an even longer pause when I was thinking, oh my God, I need help. Now does he need hours, days, weeks, or months? And then he finally said, years. While you all get older, wiser, slow down with time, and mellow with age. Perhaps this is an instance where Ronnie was not always entirely right. Not that he was unrousable. As Director of Renal Medicine, he supervised our transfer from Sept General Hospital to the Royal, and as a result, we lost the friendly availability of the Septon pharmacy, where you could always drop by and be attended to on the instant for medicines, for holidays and other family matters. At the Royal, it was all different and modern, but you had to wait. Early on, Ronnie had enough. In his own words, he left the pharmacy in a silent rage and fume of 48 to 72 hours. Now, as he himself often pointed out, the best physicians always take their time making decisions, weighing up all the many factors, unlike others who have to act more rapidly or on perhaps more simple clinical problems. In other words, Ronnie swithered, trying to make up his mind what to do. He then noticed on the third day, as he walked past pharmacy, Professor Sir Robert Shields, head of surgery in the Royal, if not Liverpool in the Northwest, sitting there patiently and humbly, meekly biding his time and waiting for his prescriptions. So Ronnie complied with the rest of us. Ronnie was one of the last general physicians on the kidney unit. We believe that he had taught us a lot of general medicine, especially in terms of attitude, calmness and professionalism, and we hope that all of these lessons will remain. In his retirement, his achievements were recognised, as has been pointed out, by the award of Personal Chair of Medicine. He continued to attend grand rounds regularly and shared the breadth of his knowledge, wisdom and experience in many committees, several of which he chaired. He joined the Liverpool Medical History Society and contributed an excellent paper listing advances in medicine made from the Northwest in the 20th century. He emphasised how serendipity and political incorrectness had led to many of these developments, suggesting that orthodoxy and the big battalions are not always the best way. On the Medical History Society Committee, we slowly watched other leaves on the tree drift off until, sadly, one of them had Ronnie's own name written upon it. It was all our very special privilege to have known and to have worked with him. Thank you, Chris, for asking me to contribute to this celebration of Ronnie's life and work.
Professor of Medicine Emeritus, and then some address, the Weatherall Institute of Molecular Medicine, John Radcliffe Hospital, Headington, Oxford. Dear Chris, I'm extremely sorry not to be able to get to Ronnie's ceremony. I've written a very short piece which I would very much appreciate having read out at the ceremony, if this is possible. I should tell you that he can't be here because there's a urgently convened world meeting in the United States, of all places, on stem cell transplantation. So, of course, Sir David is certainly our national lead on that, and so one understands why it's needed. And what he's asked me to read is pretty brief. I first met Ronnie Finn, incidentally, try and see David doing this. I can hear him dictating this. There's almost certainly a pipe in his hand. His head's at least twice my size. His intelligence is logarithms. I first met Ronnie Finn as a junior doctor in the late 1950s. I got to know him well when we were at Johns Hopkins together as research fellows a few years later, and we became good friends when I returned from the United States to Liverpool in 1965. We saw Ronnie and Joan regularly up to the period when I left for Oxford in 1974, and we greatly missed their company after the move. In the early days, it was already clear that Ronnie was going to be a top-class clinician in whatever branch of medicine he finally settled. But what struck me most about him in those early years was his almost childlike curiosity about everything and his extraordinary enthusiasm and enjoyment of the work that he had been doing in the rhesus field. The subsequent success of Cyril Clarke's group is now history, but I am certain that Ronnie's input into the early development of the ideas that finally brought the rhesus programme to fruition were invaluable, at a time when all the experts were saying that the Liverpool approach would never work. He richly deserved his later recognition for the work in this period of his career and for his subsequent success as a top-class ringing physician. Ronnie was a wonderfully entertaining friend and colleague. His often hilarious, if apparently naive views about medical science, the medical establishment, and life in general remain amongst my cherished memories of Liverpool. But I always suspected that underneath this apparently innocent exterior there was a pretty acute mind, which had the medical establishment in particular and the world in general very well worked out. The last time I saw Ronnie was at the Wellcome Trust oral history meeting, and I recall that this was less than a year ago, on the rhesus story. Ronnie gave a wonderful exposition of the days when he worked with Cyril Clarke on this problem and offered some remarkable insights into how a group of people, and this is vintage Weatherall, who knew nothing about rhesus disease, even less about neonatal medicine, and, with one notable exception, very little immunology, managed in discovering how to prevent rhesus hemolytic disease and to make one of the most important developments in preventative medicine of the second half of the 20th century. Absolutely mirroring John York's comments. As part of his exposition, Ronnie regaled us with the remarkable story of how he got a free haircut in a prison in Baltimore, where he was studying so-called volunteers as part of the rhesus program by a criminal who confessed to him that he was, as he was delving down the back of his neck with a razor, that this was the first time he'd ever been allowed to use an open blade since he'd been arrested. He writes, this was truly vintage. His final paragraph, although this is a sad occasion, particularly for Joan and the family, it's also one of genuine celebration. Ronnie was a remarkable person and one of the few clinical scientists whose work made a genuine difference to the well-being of society. Although he will be very much missed by all, there is much to celebrate in his life and work.
10 years ago, my GP peered searchingly into my ashen features and declared, "You look very ill. It's very worrying you." As it happens, a free sort of concern had rippled through my own mind, but what I wanted to know was twofold. What was the problem, and what were we going to do about it? He was a good man and clearly concerned for my well-being, but he didn't know. His examinations and various tests had provided no answer, and I continued my downward spiral. Then he had a brainwave. He sent me to see Ronnie Finn. My first visit to Rodney Street was a revelation. As I struggled to cross the consulting room to the waiting chair, I was vaguely aware that my demeanour and every movement were being scrutinised by a dark-suited, thoughtful man with a distinguished air. Following his kindly and welcoming introduction, Dr. Finn's gentle, patient, yet probing questioning exuded such an air of quiet authority that it would have been impossible not to have felt uplifted and relieved in his presence. This man of impeccably good manners and total professionalism obviously knew precisely what I was going through. And when further into the consultation, he told me that he could see immediately I had entered the room that here was a classic case of ME, a huge cloud lifted from my shoulders. Not that I was pleased to have the disease, far from it. In any case, I knew little about it. And at last, my illness had been given a name. That would, I doubt that I would have minded too much what it was called. Just as long as it was called something, and that someone knew a thing or two about it. From that moment, I came to admire and respect Ronnie for his many admirable qualities, not least because his support and guidance through the darkest and most desperate times of my illness never wavered. On that first occasion, he conducted a thorough head-to-toe examination, explaining and discussing with me each positive finding. They were always positive findings during these examinations, so that I was reassured and encouraged. The physical examinations were conducted with meticulous thoroughness on every subsequent visit, and although they might not always have been strictly necessary, in a medical sense, as time went on, they did me a power of good. You see, the symptoms of ME are many and various, and there are times when one or more of them can become so severe that it can be difficult for the patient to remain unconcerned about what else might be occurring within his feeble frame. Ronnie understood this instinctively and dispelled any possible fears and concerns with consummate skill. Although during examination all comments were positive and reassuring, there would be occasions later on when he would drop in the odd question such as, "How would you like an ECG?" I think it might be an idea, just to confirm what we already know, or we haven't had an X-ray, or blood test, or ultrasound scan for quite a while. Would you like one this week? His expertise and uplifting manner were such that by then I would have been delighted to go along with anything he suggested, feeling little concerned about what might or what was about. Following each physical examination, there were always our conversations, long, searching discussions which ranged over varied and vital topics, such as who really runs the government, the parlous state of the education service, the virtues of cruising in the Arctic, and the relative levels of difficulty of the crosswords of the Times and the Telegraph. Of course, we also spent a good deal of our time discussing ME, its symptoms, the paths of its complex development, current research findings, trial and error in the quest for a successful treatment, if not cure, as well as its possible, though uncertain, causes. As time went on and I moved from being an acute case to the chronic stage, and my mind began to function more effectively once more, these discussions became more searching and exacting as well as more enjoyable. For a while I accepted that these were simply interesting and stimulating interviews. Eventually, however, I came to realize that they had a deeper purpose. One of the symptoms of ME is a kind of brain fogging, and in order to overcome a lack of efficiency in the thought processes, appropriate intellectual stimulation has a useful part to play. Ronnie had been playing a very smart game all along. At the outset, my GP wasn't alone in thinking that the disease was more than likely symptomatic of a psychosomatic disorder. Although at the time and subsequently, I made it very clear and forcefully that if it were all in my mind, I would change my mind. I had been leading a very active, energetic, interesting and happy life with a rather successful and still developing career, so why should I choose to throw it all away when I have so much going for it? Then 3 years ago, as part of his research into ME, Ronnie sent me for a brain scan. The results showed impaired blood flow and irregularities in the process of metabolism in the brain, apparently confirming the cause of the symptoms that I had experienced in the rest of my body. Thus it was proved. We were vindicated. ME was far from a psychosomatic condition, but very much an organic disease. On the other hand, it was also something in my head. Clearly, the pictures were there. So, I suppose I am indeed a head case. So perhaps we were all correct in our assumptions, if not entirely in the way that some might have imagined. It is a great regret that Ronnie is no longer here to continue with his research. For given his expertise, intellect, determination and searching mind, I have no doubt that in time he would have begun to solve the riddle which is ME. Throughout the last 10 years, there have been many consultations with Ronnie, usually every 2 or 3 months. although I only made appointments when I was at my current best. Firstly, because when I was at my worst, I was in no fit state to visit the doctor. But secondly, because I wanted to be better for Ronnie. It had that effect. The time eventually came when he was able to say, "You look very well." And he often told me that he'd said the same thing to his mother when he was visiting her in her later years, only to be rebuked with, "What do you know?" Therefore, but that's no indication, so let's find out how you really are. During that time, Ronnie was unfailingly kindly, thoughtful, caring, and good-humoured. I recall one occasion when, during the usual thorough physical, he was scrutinising my fingernails. I remarked almost apologetically for them that they were heavily ridged. Ronnie peered closely at them, and then at his own, and said, "So am I. I wonder what it is." I suggested he put it down to too much washing up, but his immediate response was, "Oh no, that can't be it. I never do any." He added with a smile, "My wife spoils me." Notwithstanding his immense ability and professional achievements and distinction, Ronnie was never, in my experience, grand or overbearing or self-important. Rather, he was to me not just my physician, but my friend, who was continually looking out for me, encouraging, leading me to gradual and sustainable improvement. He was quietly inspirational, always the gentleman, the gentle man. His wise counsel, in spite of the difficulties and obstacles that Emmy has created in my life, has brought me to the point where I can, for much of the time at least, successfully manage my condition so that for part of almost every day, I can actually pretend I'm normal. I still have Emmy, and I remain subject to its limitations. But because of a very special man called Professor Ronnie Finn, it no longer has dominion over me as it once did. Thanks to Ronnie, the progress I have made since that first consultation when I was so ill, I was quite prepared to accept my final demise. The progress I have made is immense, and the quality of my life has improved to formerly unimaginable levels. I wish you were still here, so that we could make further progress together. But I am inordinately fortunate in having been in his care for so long. Like so many others, I am better for having known him.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joan, for the invitation to be here. And Chris, thank you. I've known Ronnie since the late 70s and have admired him as a colleague and as a friend throughout all these years. When we met, it was a small group, an inaugural meeting of clinical ecologists. We were thought to be very much outsiders, but Ronnie had a different view of the world from some doctors in that I am able to reflect some of these views that he had here. He was in this community in Liverpool a very high-standing member of the medical fraternity, and yet he had a view of medicine which was much broader than what he was allowed to evince in his formal training here, his formal duties here. I've been very privileged to know Ronnie for all these years. We were founder members of the organisation. We shared the view that environmental aspects of illness were not being considered as widely as they should be, or appreciated as fully as they should be. And following our inaugural meeting, he attended many conferences on these aspects of illness, and I will quote from some of them from his contributions, because his views were profound, but expressed in a very simple and a very conclusive manner. He went to a conference in Dallas virtually annually. These were international conferences on man in his environment, in health and disease. And he would speak there annually at this conference, and he would also be involved in summarizing the entire symposium. That he was incredibly attentive to every person. And he said to me that he would sign up everybody as being excellent in everything that they did because of the effort that they put into this and because their contribution was always evocative and compelling. At the fourth annual international conference, which was in 1986, he said that classical allergy is very limited. A new concept of allergy recognizes the involvement of non-immunological mechanisms. Individuals may be sensitive to environmental agents in a very broad sense. Environmental factors are seen to play a much larger part in the cause of disease than previously thought. He discussed at the following symposium how Hippocrates was the first to emphasize the importance of the environment in human disease and pointed out that sensitivity could be either immunological or chemical. At another meeting, he described hydrocarbon sensitivity and suggested that it was a sensitivity rather than a general toxic reaction that occurred in some individuals, as hydrocarbon exposure is common and the disease of the sensitivity is rare. He was perspicacious in everything he observed. He described many of the biochemical responses with defective enzyme systems, and his thoughts encompassed addiction as well as toxic problems. He talked of Crohn's disease, asthma, renal disease, the interaction between chemical exposure and classical allergy, food allergy. He did a 10-year study and pronounced on this, and he then emphasized the importance of chemical sensitivity in clinical medicine. He's also spoken about cancer, dementia, renal disease. His scope was vast. I mention all of this because Ronnie was a giant in medicine. His appreciation was beyond that of the narrow confines of a specialty. He substantiated his thoughts with evidence, but he wasn't stilted. New thoughts crowded into his conceptual views and allowed him not only to be analytical, but to have the breadth of vision that's needed in assessing any particular patient or any particular aspect of medicine. And he became a familiar figure at the British Society for Allergy, Environmental and Nutritional medicine meetings. He was the president of that organisation. And he also at conferences in the United States. He attended there from 1984 to 2002, presenting his work and analysing conferences every year. He was as familiar in the United States for his strength of character and outspoken views as he was in the United Kingdom. The views of some of our colleagues from the States follow, and I'm pleased to be able to represent them here. Professor William Ray and Dr. Alan Lieberman have said, Ronnie was an avid supporter of environmental medicine. He once told us that his feeling was that 95% of the solution to illness was going to be solved by environmental studies, and only 5% by genetic manipulation. And this came from the man who won the Lascaux Award for his part in the development program. Ronnie, the nephrologist, the man who used the artificial kidney, knew, and this is the American phraseology, knew that prevention was the name of the game. He thrust the last part of his life into what he considered to be the most important of medical science, the study of environmental aspects of health. Ronnie was a free thinker, and he was also a dreamer. He would start with a question attempt to arrive at an answer by using available data. One of his most formidable lectures was when he presented data that concluded that the observation that the greater the number of drugs a person took, the greater the risk of developing cancer. It was a profound presentation for physicians practicing environmental medicine, who then recognised the importance of the total load, individual susceptibility, and detoxification. He always made his point. Ronnie closed the conferences in the States and in these international conferences with his brilliant assessments of the talks and some philosophy. His lovely wife, Jo, always accompanied him, and we enjoyed many conversations with both Ronnie. Ronnie always emphasised good scientific studies, and yet he didn't hesitate to present cases that exemplified a point. We pay tribute to our respected colleague and friend. And thank you for the privilege of being here.
The former Vice-Chancellor of the University and his wife are great personal friends of Ronnie and Jem and the family, and it's a pleasure to invite Philip Black to say a few words and reflections on Ronnie as a man.
It's rather strange, ladies and gentlemen, to be back in this Senate room with what appears to be a friendly audience. Notice I said appears to be. And I think it's rather fitting that this tribute to Ronnie is being held here in the heart of the University of Liverpool, in the Senate room, having regard to the fact that one of Ronnie Finn's ambitions as a young doctor was in fact to become a clinical academic. Now, although he never formally came onto the University of Liverpool's payroll, he was indeed, as you've all heard, by his achievements, both as a skilled and caring clinician, and also as a researcher of international renown, a clinical academic of the highest caliber. We've heard this evening how his research led to the development of a vaccine for rhesus-negative mothers to protect their unborn babies. And although Ronnie was part of the team led by Cyril Clarke and Richard McConnell, it was Ronnie who made the crucial contribution to solving the rhesus hemolytic disease problem for the newborn. You would never have thought that his was the brains behind the discovery which led to the prevention of rhesus hemolytic disease, and, as we've heard, the saving of countless lives. And I think this exemplifies the greatest among Ronnie's many admirable qualities, his humility. If I might quote John Ruskin, I believe the first test of a truly great man is humility, a view which I strongly endorse. I read again recently the appreciation which Ronnie wrote in the newsletter of the Association of Liverpool Medical School, ARMS, many of the members here tonight, on the occasion of Cyril Clarke's 90th birthday. This contains anecdotes, many amusing anecdotes, which I won't refer to, you can read them yourselves, anecdotes relating to Ronnie's time as a junior hospital doctor under Cyril. But it fails even to hint at the seminal contribution made by Ronnie himself to the work which brought such international renown to Cyril's department. Ronnie was always praising his colleagues and their achievements, and seemed genuinely to believe that their contributions were greater than his. And in the obituary which he wrote in the same newsletter on the occasion of Cyril Clarke's death, he said that Cyril's Department of Medicine had been the most productive in the country, and probably the best. He meant it was the best. He said also that David Weatherall had directed the molecular biology group, that David Price Evans, whom I'm delighted to see here tonight, had broken ground in pharmacogenetics, and finally that Clark and McConnell led the Rhesus group. Again, no mention of the mighty Finn. Now, despite our many social meetings, he never mentioned to me, or even hinted at the leading role played by him in the Rhesus breakthrough. He had ample opportunity to do so, but never did so. He most certainly hid his light under a bushel, and it was only after he retired from clinical work in 1997, as we've heard, that senior members of the university's Faculty of Medicine, led by Malcolm Jackson and John Colley, took steps to have his world-class research skills recognised by proposing to me, as the then Vice-Chancellor, that he should be awarded the honorary title of Visiting Professor in the Department of Medicine. Having studied Ronnie's CV, I had no hesitation whatsoever in recommending to the Senate the award of the honorary chair, which was duly conferred on him, much to his great delight, and in recognition of which, as we've heard, he presented to the Department of Medicine his citation for the Alaska Award for Clinical Research, the American Nobel Prize in Medicine. And that citation, in its last case, has a position of prominence in the Faculty of Medicine, so that future generations of medical students at this university will be constantly reminded of the most outstanding achievement of one of their distinguished professors and predecessors. And, of course, the chair which we've heard about tonight, the chair which will bear his name, will underline that fact further. Now, it would be an understatement of the grossest kind to say that Ronnie Finn had an inquiring mind. He was an enthusiast for matters novel. He was a non-mainstream original thinker. As one of his former colleagues said to me, and he's here tonight, Jonathan, he was not a Me Too scientist. And although some of his interest could have been regarded as being in the field of fringe medicine, he never advocated any course of action which had not been rigorously tested. And I believe that he once suggested that there are 4 stages in the development of a new medical idea. Stage 1, you're mad. Stage 2, I suppose there might be something in it. Stage 3, there could be something in it, but where's the proof? And stage 4, well, of course, we knew all along. And it was back in 1976, as we've heard, that he became interested in the subject of allergy. But he was determined to inject some science into this new area of interest. A paper from 1978 was the first statistically sound study showing that unexplained symptoms can sometimes be caused by food intolerance. And although that was then a fringe medicine subject, a learned society devoted to allergy did exist. But Ronnie and some other like-minded colleagues thought that a new learned society was needed to include toxicology and idiosyncrasy as well as immunology. And so there was born in 1979 the British Society for Allergy, Environmental and Nutritional Medicine, as we've heard. Ronnie was its first secretary and he became its second president. Ronnie was not one to sit on the sidelines and let others get on with the hard work. He was not only a generator of original ideas, but also very much a hands-on doer. Ronnie was also the defender of any underdog whom he regarded as having been unfairly treated. I think the best example of this is the support which he gave to Arpad Pushtai, when he, as some of you will recall, was suspended by the Rowden Research Institute in Aberdeen over his revelations about the adverse effects of genetically modified tatties on laboratory rats. I said tatties since it's the Rowan Institute in Aberdeen. Although his suspension was subsequently lifted, he was prevented from continuing his experiments on transgenic potatoes because his contract was not renewed after he revealed his findings on British television. It was this aggressive and unfair treatment which led Ronnie and Professor Jonathan Rose, who is here tonight, and Dr. Vivian Howard, who is also here tonight, to allow their names to be included in a memorandum signed by 20 distinguished scientists in support of Pushtai, whom they all knew to be an honourable and careful scientist. Ronnie, Jonathan and Vivian wrote to the Independent in March of 1999, saying that had the Rowett simply released a statement saying that Pushtai's data was preliminary and allowed his work to continue, much of the hoo-ha, much of the confusion would have been prevented. The message which Pushtai was trying to put across was simply that genetically modified foods require particularly careful testing before release, and that some will prove toxic or otherwise unsatisfactory and be discarded. And with that message, Ronnie, Jonathan and Vivian strongly agreed, and they were all prepared to put their heads over the parapet in support of the underdog. Ronnie's interests beyond the field of medicine were many and varied, to say the very least. Some of you will have heard him talking on these subjects, ranging from the curse of Tutankhamun to the Philby, Burgess and MacLean spying, to the paranormal, and more recently, and for obvious reasons, to the Rothschilds, and in particular Victor and Miriam. Unfortunately, I never heard Ronnie lecture on any of these topics. Always good-humoured, Ronnie was a very clubbable person. He was a member of the Ormskirk Brandreth and the Liverpool Athenaeum clubs. He was also a dedicated supporter of his beloved Liverpool St Helens Rugby Club, which he found time to support most Saturday afternoons. But Richard, he never bragged about that, right? In addition to supporting the clubs just mentioned, he was also a staunch supporter of Liverpool University Women's Club, a club which Jones served with great energy and distinction as its chairman for 3 years from 1997 to 2000. And it was during these 3 years that my wife Isabel, the then president of the club, and I got to know Ronnie and Joan very well. And I can vouch from personal experience for his modesty, for his concern for others, for his very keen continued interest in and support for his alma mater, and for his very lively and original mind, and for his constant cheerfulness. And I think it's particularly fitting that this commemorative ceremony is being held here in the Senate room, the principal meeting place for Liverpool University's Women's Club, a venue to which I suspect in his early days as a young member, or sorry, in her early days as a young member, Joan dragged Ronnie along, kicking and screaming. But in more recent years, Ronnie required no arm twisting by Joan to attend club functions, but he acted as the perfect support to Joan, her very own Dennis Thatcher, as it were, during her chairmanship of the club. Ronnie was also the Women's Club unofficial sommelier, a task which he carried out with great generosity, I'm pleased to say, and always with a twinkle in his eye. And in conclusion, Ronnie Finn will long be remembered, not only for his outstanding achievements as a clinical scientist of international renown, but also for his humility, his humanity, his inquiring mind, for his concern for his fellow man, and for his great good humour.
after listening to the very outstanding papers that the preceding speakers have given, there leaves me with little else to say about Ronnie. The academic side of his life has been totally elucidated. His outstanding personal qualities, including humility, diffidence and wisdom, have been reiterated. Jonathan has talked about him as a family man, but I'd like to mention a few other points about life with Ronnie. Although he was a very conventional person, life was never static. In fact, it was frequently very stimulating. No matter which part of the country we were in, or even the world, he always managed to find something to excite him, and somehow there would be a contact nearby. One occasion was in San Francisco, when an allergy friend, whose home we were visiting, told us that her next-door neighbour was Edward Teller. Another time, we were luxuriating in the lovely artist town of Santa Fe, but Ronnie was even happier when we did a tour of nearby Los Alamos, and the scientist part of him took over, and he then explained a Manhattan Project to me. One time we were in Luxor so that Ronnie could prove what caused the premature deaths of Lord Carnarvon and other members of the team, who were led by Howard Carter, opened Tutankhamun's tomb. This necessitated wearying visits to the office of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities to obtain a pass for descending the tombs. Eventually, we were allowed into Queen Ti's tomb. She's Tutankhamun's grandmother. This necessitated a perilous descent by means of a rope ladder, and I heaved a sigh of relief when I turned around and saw an upright Ronnie in the tomb. It is very sad that he is unable to join his colleagues in celebrating their 50 years of entry to this medical school to be held next month. Although this is the law of diminishing returns, with an ever-decreasing number of past faculty members left to carry the can. Nevertheless, Ronnie was quite excited to be on the planning side of these celebrations, part of which includes a trip to Nice, which would have been a very pleasant interlude. A few weeks ago, there was the 25th anniversary of the British Society for Allergy and Environmental Medicine, which was Ronnie's brainchild, and which he insisted on all committee members writing a paper about their experiences. Although he collected all the papers, he didn't live to attend the conference in June, nor did he live to attend the annual Dallas Conference on Clinical Ecology, also held in June. This special American society enabled us to jet across the Atlantic many times and cement the friendships we formed over the last quarter of a century. Ronnie was a very good and loyal friend, as evidenced by the turnout here tonight. And at this juncture, I must thank you all for coming and tangibly expressing your feelings. Although you are too many to mention by name and have come from all areas of the country and beyond, I feel I ought to name Ronnie's oldest friend, Eddie Curitin, who with Carolyn, his wife, landed at Manchester Airport this morning, having travelled all night from Rhode Island. I don't know how they managed to look so alert after missing a night's sleep. And I must also mention David Price Evans, former professor of medicine, who has recently arrived from Riyadh, and whose friendship with Ronnie goes back to the old recess days. Ronnie formed a very memorable partnership with Vivian Howard. If you remember when the great GM Foods controversy erupted in 1997, culminating in the push-type affair, which has been mentioned, Vivian pushed Ronnie into being a spokesman for the scientists. Ronnie was very much returned when given his department of human anatomy and cell biology, and I've had notes from his colleagues saying that Friday, Ronnie's day for visiting the department will never be the same again without him. Talking of thank yous, we wouldn't be here tonight were it not for Chris Evans, who is masterminding this evening. Chris is perhaps, or was perhaps, Ronnie's greatest admirer, as he and Sue were on Ronnie's firm in 1964, since when they've both done spectacularly well in their own spheres. In 1995, we were at a meeting of the Association of Physicians, when Chris reminded us that Ronnie was retiring, and what about a retirement party? Ronnie shook his head vehemently, but was overruled by Chris and Sue, who said they were not taking no for an answer and would make his retirement party. They did indeed, and it turned into a superb function at the Royal. However, that was not the end of the celebrations for Ronnie, because in December 2001, he was made honorary life member of the Medical Institution, and Chris's final words in his tribute were, "Ronnie will be regarded as one of this institution's, the city's, and this university's most distinguished physicians of the 20th century." Thank you, Chris, for your long friendship and loyalty to Ronnie and me. I must mention one of Ronnie's newer friends, colleagues with whom he had a very close friendship and who sustained him during his last few months. And that is John Corley, without whom I doubt whether tonight's commemoration would have gone so smoothly had it not been for John's dexterity. The other great friend and colleague I have to mention, who at the moment is swelling up the Baltic and is very sad to be missing this gathering, is John Goldsmith, whose friendship via the renal unit has endured for 38 years. Even though it's not possible to mention you all by name, please feel that each and every one of you was special to Ronnie. As you know, he always had time for everyone. Thank you.
There are actually several bouquets to go.
But this is
That's one of the group. Another bouquet, and that's for John Corley's secretary, Pam Mills, who was the name on the bottom right-hand side of the invitation, whose telephone number you were to ring if you were coming. And certainly like to thank Pam very much indeed. I'm not quite sure where she is.
I suspect she's in the back.
Well, we've got the bouquet for her too.